Hi, welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. Northern Virginia is a community of communities, and every one of these communities has its own history, not always well known. Our guest today is Charlie Clark, often known as our man in Arlington, who is here to tell us about the hidden history of Arlington County. Charlie, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here, Chuck.
So, Arlington, tell us about early days in Arlington.
Well, it goes back to the 18th century when it was part of the English land grants to Lord Fairfax. And then when the District of Columbia was created around a big swamp by the Potomac, after a big political compromise, Arlington was included with Alexandria in the diamond-shaped District of Columbia, 1797. But by 1846, there was some restlessness among the Virginians who wanted a little more of the federal buildings, and there were some issues about slavery. There's some feeling that maybe the Northerners weren't as sympathetic to the slave-owning South. So they voted to what was called retrocede or retrocession in 1846. So it became Alexandria County with the rural area mostly in Arlington, and then what we know as Old Town Alexandria as the urban section of it. And in 1920, this state assembly, after being Arlingtonians and Alexandrians being confused all the time, voted to separate Arlington from Alexandria County, and that it was just a small little item on the front pages of the Washington Post and the Evening Star.
Mm-hmm. And how did it get its name then?
The name, it comes from George Washington Parke Custis, who was the step-grandson of the father of our country, George Washington. He was raised at Mount Vernon after his own father had died, and with his sister Nellie Custis, who's really better known. So George Washington Parke Custis inherited a lot of the land in Arlington and Fairfax and Alexandria from his step-grandmother, Martha Dandridge Washington. And he built Arlington House starting in 1802. It took him about 12, 15 years to build it. And he named it for the plantation on the eastern shore of Virginia, near Cape Charles, north of Norfolk. And my wife and I took a visit there a year and a half ago and saw the original plantation ruins are still there, and there's plaques, although it's right in with suburban ranch homes next door to it. And that, in turn, was named Arlington by the ancestor John Custis for most likely an Arlington in Gloucester district of England. Mm-hmm. And there was also like an Earl of Arlington in that 17th century time period that might have inspired the name as well.
Okay, so we know Arlington House is still standing there, the Custis Lee Mansion, the Arlington Cemetery. But are there any other early houses from that period that
Yes, the oldest house in Arlington is called the Ball Sellers House. And John Ball was a settler and farmer in the 18th century. It goes back to sometime in the 1750s. And it's off of Carlin Springs Road and near Route 50, and you can visit it today. The Arlington Historical Society maintains it, keeps it open on weekends. And Mrs. Sellers was the 20th century owner who bequeathed it to the Historical Society in the county.
Now, I know in your book you talk about Abingdon, which is...
Yes. Well, that has another George Washington Parke Custis connection. So Abingdon is on the site right near Reagan National Airport, and when you go to the airport, when you get off on the metro, or when you park your car, you can see signs to go visit the ruins of Abingdon Plantation. They aren't literal ruins, they're recreated brick parts, where, the layout of the foundation. The actual house, which is built in the, I think the 1770s or 80s, was burned down in the 1930s, so they have pictures of it. And George Washington used to stay there when his son-in-law, John Parke Custis, who was killed early in the Revolutionary War, which is why George Washington Parke Custis, his son, became an orphan. So it's other drama unfolded at that house. There's a Civil War memoir of a gentleman who grew up in that house.
So. See, that's the intriguing thing about the name of your book. It's hidden history. Now, you know, there we go to National airport all the time, and yet, you know, it's literally on top of this house that
Yes.
nobody's heard of. So what is your definition of hidden history?
Well, I have a little tongue-in-cheek preface to the book where I go into that, and it's basically off the beaten track history, lesser known facts. So I set up the book at the beginning with a pretty straightforward capsule history of Arlington written by former county board and school board chairman Mary Hines. And that's followed by another little preface by the head of the Arlington County Central Library's Center for Local History on how research is done as Arlington. And then you get little wiseacre comments from me on little facts that I come across in my work writing the weekly column for the Falls Church News Press called Our Man in Arlington. So I come across these tidbits, and sometimes they inspire a whole column, sometimes they inspire just a little squib at the end, which I do. And we group them, the publisher and I, by theme, so that, you know, with personalities and the grimmer side of Arlington and the early history of Arlington with the archaeology and everything. So the book, The Hidden History of Arlington, it's in short bites. The essays are about 600 words. Some have been expanded. They've all been updated since they originally appeared in the Falls Church paper.
So now how do you come about finding these stories?
Well, one thing I always mention to people is that there are 82 historical signs along the roadsides in Arlington, and they were erected at different times, but a lot of people never bother to pull over and read them. Mm-hmm. So I start with that. In fact, the Arlington County Schools right now are doing a little lesson plan based on those signs. And some of them are a little biased, I think. I give one example in a later column. It didn't make it into the book. At Wilson Boulevard and Bluemont Park, which is right below Upton Hill. And during the Civil War, Upton Hill was a fort. And the sign, which has since been knocked sideways by a truck, calls it a Confederate outpost. And it's true that during 1861, right after the Battle of Manassas Bull Run, the Confederate troops swept into that hill, and it has a great view of Washington, and they set up what are called Quaker cannon, which are fake cannon made out of wood and painted logs painted brown. And from a distance through binoculars, the enemy mistakes them for actual cannon. They have some replicas of it there, set up there now. But the Confederates only controlled that Fort Upton Hill for 3 months. Mm-hmm. And then the Union troops took it back, and they controlled it for the next 4 years. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't call it a Confederate outpost. I would just call it a Civil War outpost.
Yeah, interesting. So what's some other hidden history from the Civil War?
Well, I like to talk about the George Washington Survey Tree, because this is actual turf on which the father of our country trod. If you go to the Long Branch Nature Center, which is off Carlin Springs Road in South Arlington, near Route 50, and take their trail, you can easily miss, but you happen on a sort of a semicircular brick wall, and behind it is a scarred and marred monument. And it used to say, in much more legible language, that here stood George Washington's survey tree, which, if you read George Washington's diaries, which I have, it shows up in a lot of his daily accounts of he was exploring from Mount Vernon, looking for a timber supply for Mount Vernon, and so that's why he acquired some of this land, and he used this huge tree as a marker on a lot of the plats that he drew. And today you can see an actual slice of that tree, which has been preserved and varnished and is on display at the Carlin Springs Public Library.
Mm-hmm. So Arlington was pretty rural and well into the 19th century. When did it start to grow into what we know today?
Well, that's a very good question. After World War II, there's a new book out called Code Girls about Arlington Hall, which is where the intelligence people cracked the Japanese code, and they imported all kinds of women from around the country because the men were off fighting in World War II. My mother was one of those code girls, and I've written that in my earlier book about how if Arlington Hall hadn't existed, I wouldn't exist either, because my parents met there. But so the influx of government girls and the building of the Pentagon and during the war, and then after the war, the whole post-war economic boom where the government was growing and they were setting up new departments. That's what really sparked Arlington to become more than just kind of a rural, quiet pass-through area.
Mm-hmm.
So.
But I guess before it got its kind of current government type character, it had some rambunctious days. We were talking about before the show about Roslyn and its checkered past.
So Roslyn, which is now a glass tower office center, was filled at the time, about 1905, 1910, with pawn shops and brothels and gambling halls. And there was sort of a mini version of it a little bit further down the Potomac in something called Jackson City, which is where the 14th Street Bridge meets the Arlington shoreline. And that goes back to 1836, actually. President Andrew Jackson, the namesake, actually laid the cornerstone there at Jackson City. And it was also a rough place. And I remember seeing on one of the documentaries about DC history is that the Fairfax farmers would be on their horse and carts trying to bring their produce to market in downtown DC, and they would have to go through Roslyn, and they would have to have bodyguards with weapons because there was a lot of thieves that would attack them. And so there was a famous sheriff and Commonwealth's attorney named Crandall Mackey, about whom much has been written, in the teens and 20s, who went through Roslyn with clubs and billy clubs and shut down a lot of the those houses of ill repute. So.
Well, was he rewarded with higher office? Did he become governor? Or
well,
anything?
no, he didn't become governor, but he is well regarded by a lot of law and order types. So.
I see. Now, there's a name we don't hear very often or ever. Are there other notable personalities that we need to know about from the early days?
Well, I have some profiles of Austin Kiplinger, the business news editor, whose father started the Kiplinger newsletter back in the 20s. Austin grew up here in Arlington, attended Arlington schools until high school, and then he switched to private schools downtown. I profile the developer Preston Crothers, who built the Southern Towers and a lot of other high-rise towers around, and was a prominent member of Washington Golf and Country Club. I have a profile of a beauty queen named Gail Renshaw, who was the runner-up to Miss World in about 1964 or 5, and she went out to Las Vegas at age 19 with her chaperone. And Dean Martin, the singer, was performing out there, and he met her and fell in love with her, and within a week had proposed marriage, and he was like 49 and she was 19 and he was married. So the engagement lasted about a week and then it was called off. But I enjoyed interviewing her and about her years in Arlington schools and all that.
So you interviewed her.
Yeah.
Well, that must have been interesting. And she still lives in Arlington?
She moved down to Florida.
I see, okay.
Had to track her down. And one other personality who grew up in Arlington is the actor Nicholas Hammond, who performed in the 1965 movie Sound of Music as one of the Von Trapp brothers, and he was also in the 1963 movie Lord of the Flies. And he, as a child actor, and he went on through Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown high schools. He left Yorktown a little early, and then he became an actor and producer in the 70s. He played Spider-Man. He's still active, and he lives in Sydney, Australia. So I interviewed him by email about his memories of Arlington schools.
Now, I know one of the little treasures of Arlington that I stumbled on was those murals that were done in one of the post offices during the Depression. Can you tell us?
Well, yeah, the author of a book, who's a retired journalist, did a nice little reproduction of all those books. It's not in my book, but I did write a little squib in my column about him. And the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s was a New Deal program designed both to create work for struggling artists and to decorate communities. And so this visionary artist created scenes of American life going back to the Indian days and to the Civil War. And there's a slight local theme. I think Great Falls appears in one of them. They're beautifully done, and you can see them at the main, what used to be the main post office in Clarendon.
Yeah. Does anybody offer like walking tours of the neighborhoods in Arlington?
There's a whole organization called Walk Arlington, and I've taken maybe 2 or 3 of their walks. You know, they'll do Crystal City or the old Glebe neighborhood. And it's both exercise and historical tours. And Lauren Hassel runs that. I recommend it to people.
Now, we were talking about some of the grimmer personalities, like I guess the George Lincoln Rockwell.
That's right. So I've written quite a bit on this outside of this book for the Arlington Historical Society and for other magazines, several columns on it. The American Nazi Party was founded in 1958 by George Lincoln Rockwell, who was a World War II and Korean War veteran, a naval aviator, commander, and he became a racist and anti-Semite after reading Hitler's Mein Kampf when he was stationed in Iceland. So he got some financial backing and he moved to Arlington, Virginia, because it was outside of the nation's capital conveniently, and it was also southern enough, so he thought he would get some sympathy from racial superiority types who were in both Arlington and the rest of Virginia. And he bought a house, or he rented a house on Williamsburg Boulevard, and then he organized the party, and they had about 4 other locations, their headquarters, all of which I've documented. And Rockwell, they picketed Mario's Pizza in Arlington, and they picketed the movie Exodus when it opened downtown. They picketed the White House on the East Street Ellipse. They were publicity hounds. They caused a lot of consternation in the neighborhoods about whether they were a threat to young children. They did kidnap a kid once. And the newspapers struggled over how much to cover them because they were publicity seekers. So every time they protested, the newspapers were reluctant to give them more publicity. And then Rockwell was assassinated 50 years ago, this year, in August, at the Dominion Hill Shopping Center, which is near where his barracks headquarters was, which is on Upton Hill, which I mentioned earlier, the Civil War fort. And he was killed by a disgruntled follower. And 50 years later, the neo-Nazis, as I predicted, came back to have a ceremony there in August. And we got a picture of that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, on a more positive note, you also write about the civil rights movement. And would you tell us a little about
Sure.
that?
Well, the Supreme Court ruled in the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which involved a Kansas plaintiff and some others, in 1954. And so the ruling that whites-only schools were not separate and equal with blacks was resisted in Virginia for the next 5 years. And so the program was called Massive Resistance. A lot of white families refused to integrate, and they set up Christian academies. And it went into the courts again in Virginia. And meanwhile, sort of liberal white families and some black NAACP people in Halls Hill and other neighborhoods in Arlington set up a plan to challenge it in court, and then they won at the Virginia Supreme Court, and the governor, Almond, had to reverse his support for massive resistance. And so they integrated Stratford Junior High, which is there on Lee Highway. It is occupied currently by the H.B. Woodlawn Alternative High School program, which will be moving in a year or two, and the Stratford building will become a massive junior high, middle school, I should say. But so on this day in February, I believe it was February 2nd or so, I have it in the book, the 4 African Americans who had been coached were accompanied by police officers for fear of violence. They had gotten teachers to volunteer to which ones would take them in their classes, and they got students to volunteer to eat lunch with them, but there was some reluctance on everybody's part. But it all worked out smoothly. There wasn't any violence that day. There just was the fear of violence. So.
Now, you've talked a lot about the Arlington Historical Society. Tell us a little more about that.
Sure. They were founded in the mid-1950s and over at Glebe House, which was owned at the time by Frank Ball, who's a former state senator and a former Commonwealth attorney as well. And they now are headquartered at the Hume School, which was built in 1890s and still has a bell and a little red schoolhouse type classroom you can visit. But they have displays there and a little bookstore, and they're only open on Saturdays and Sundays from 1 to 4. But They have over 100 members of the society, and you get an annual magazine, which I write for, the Arlington Historical Magazine, and they have speakers events and an annual banquet. And what I like about being a member, I've been a member for 10 or 15 years, is that none of us knows all the history of Arlington, but when you get a bunch of these people in one room, you can put together a pretty good approximation. So.
Well, it's a very transient area. Are there a lot of native Arlingtonians or not?
Well, I run into them quite a bit. I mean, I'm almost a native Arlingtonian. I was born at GW Hospital, and my parents moved to Arlington within 6 months, so I count myself.
I think that counts.
And then I went all through school in Arlington, went away to college, settled in Alexandria for 15 years, but then we moved back to Arlington in '93, so I've been here for 25 years since then. But yeah, I run into lots of people who grew up here, and it's true there's a lot of military and government families that shuffle in and out. But whenever I do run into somebody who grew up here in the 20s or 30s, I try and write a column on it. I've done at least 2, maybe 3 of those.
Well, you talk a little bit about 9/11, which is obviously one of the biggest things that ever happened in Arlington County.
Yes. So a lot of people associate it, understandably, with New York City and the Twin Towers, and of course the Shanksville, Pennsylvania site is just opened, I guess, a year ago, and that's I hope to make a visit out there to pay tribute to the victims on that flight. But what's notable about Arlington is not what people do remember is that the Pentagon itself was attacked. I have friends who were sitting in a car on 395 and saw the plane hit. And all the victims, I guess maybe it's 180. Don't quote me on that number, but they have a Pentagon memorial there with a little chair for each of those victims. But what my essay on it talks about is the first responders, both from Arlington and neighboring Fairfax, who became national models for how to handle situations like this. Of course, there would be many more terrorist attacks and domestic shooting attacks. And so I went to a very interesting talk on how they improvised and what challenges they ran into during the 24 hours following this horrible and unforeseen attack by Mark Schwartz, who's now the deputy county manager. So, Jim Schwartz, I'm sorry. Mark Schwartz is the county manager. Jim Schwartz is his deputy, who was the former fire chief. So.
Now let's take a step a little outside of the norm and talk about some ghost stories.
Sure. Well, that's one of the joys of writing a column and creating a book later, is that you can gather these rare stories as you go. They wouldn't all present themselves at once. But as I mentioned, Arlington Hall, where my parents met, is now the Foreign Service Institute, where diplomats go to take mid-career training. And a gentleman I met there told me this story about a former employee who died and was unhappy as an employee there, and that several of the current employees have seen in the office where she worked objects move and doors slam. And I have 2 more. One of them is related to the Overly Pool ghost from the Margaret Feebry, has been spotted by several Overly members and the manager who lives in the house there, and that's been written up. But I got a fresh version of it from.
What is that? Is that a
Overly Swim Club?
Oh, a swim club.
Yeah,
Okay.
Overly Community Association's right there on Lee Highway, and it was created in 1957. So one of the neighbors has seen unexplained figures running through her house that she thinks might be that same ghost that has been seen at Overly. And then finally, I cheated a little bit. I have vignettes on a house on Minor Hill, which I say cheated because it's technically in McLean. It's 200 yards into McLean from Arlington. But it is what I had called the Dolly Madison House. It was built in the 1740s by George Minor on Minor's Hill, which is the highest point in Arlington, which is where there was a Civil War hospital. During the War of 1812, which is to say when the British burned Washington in 1814, James Madison and Dolly Madison had to flee the White House, and their route is traced through Arlington and Falls Church and McLean. And Dolly Madison would have stayed in this George Minor's house in 1814. And so the house, which was just torn down about 6 months ago. I talked to the former owners who grew up there, and I talked to the real estate agents and the builders and everybody. The historical preservationists tried to preserve it, but there just wasn't the funding for it. So I talked to the woman who grew up in the house, and she told me all about seeing dishes move and be replaced the next day when, without any explanation, and they would refer to that as a ghost.
Wow. Well, we want to thank you for coming in, and a token of our appreciation, I have a little gift for you, the Historic Cemeteries of Northern Virginia.
Excellent. Glad to see that, yeah. Okay.
And we'd like to thank you for tuning in to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, future. This show has been brought to you by a generous gift from the Margarita W. and Donald J. Metzger Endowment. We'd love to hear from you at timetravel21@yahoo.com, and visit our website at www.timetravel21.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.